At my wedding reception, my sister grabbed my arm and said, "Mom and Dad's divorce was my greatest achievement." "What?" I asked as the band played our father-daughter dance song without our father there because he hadn't spoken to any of us in 3 years. My sister Heather pulled me away from my new husband into the coat room, where nobody could hear us over the music. "I did it. I'm the reason they're not together anymore." She said it like she was proud, like she'd accomplished something incredible. I stared at her perfect makeup and her bridesmaid dress that cost more than most people's rent, because Heather always got whatever she wanted. "What are you talking about?" I thought maybe she meant she'd accidentally revealed Dad's affair, or found Mom's secret credit cards or something that exposed problems that were already there. She smiled, and it was the same smile she had when she got into Yale, and when she got her investment banking job, and when she bought her penthouse apartment at 25. Mom was so annoying, always asking about homework and checking if we ate vegetables and wanting to know where we were going. She never shut up about grades and college applications and our futures. I couldn't stand it anymore. My brain wasn't processing what she was saying because it didn't make sense. So what? All moms do that stuff. But Heather shook her head like I was too simple to understand. Not like ours. She was obsessive. Remember how she'd wait up until we got home even if it was 3 in the morning? How she'd call our friends' parents to verify sleepover stories? She made me look like a child in front of everyone. I remembered those things, but I remembered them as Mom caring about us, not as some terrible offense. She loved us. She was protecting us. Heather laughed and it was cold. She was suffocating us, so I fixed it. The music outside got louder as someone opened the door, but Heather pushed it closed again. Fixed what? How do you fix parents being protective? That's when her smile got bigger. You make them hate each other more than they love their kids. My stomach turned because I was starting to understand what she was telling me. I started small, left Mom's earring in Dad's car, but not just any earring. One she'd lost months before, one she'd accused the cleaning lady of stealing. Heather examined her manicured nails while she talked. Dad brought it home all confused, asking how it got there. Mom immediately assumed he'd been going through her jewelry box. First fight. She counted on her fingers like she was listing accomplishments. Then I changed Dad's phone password and told Mom he was hiding something. When he couldn't explain why he'd changed it because he hadn't, she got more suspicious. Second fight. My legs felt weak and I sat down on someone's coat. I signed Dad up for dating sites using his work email. Made sure Mom would find the welcome emails. He denied it, but who believes that? Third fight. Then I really got creative. She pulled out her phone to check the time like she was bored. Remember when Dad missed your high school graduation because he was in Boston? I nodded because that had destroyed Mom. I booked that trip. Used his credit card and his email to confirm a conference registration. He thought his secretary did it. Mom thought he chose work over family again. The room was spinning and I wanted to throw up. Why would you do that? They were happy. We were happy. But Heather just rolled her eyes. You were happy because you were Mom's favorite. Her little baby who could do nothing wrong. I was the one she constantly harassed about everything. Were my grades high enough? Was I dating the right boys? Was I picking the right college major? She questioned every single decision I made. She adjusted her dress in the mirror behind me. After the graduation thing, I started deleting Dad's texts to Mom. Apologies, explanations, dinner plans. She'd wait at restaurants alone while he sat at home wondering why she never showed up to the dinners he'd planned. My parents had been married for 28 years before the divorce. Dad won't even talk to us now. Mom cries herself to sleep. You ruined everything because she asked about your homework? I was screaming, but the music drowned it out. Not just homework. Everything. She was in my business constantly. Now she's too depressed to bother anyone. Dad's gone, so no more family dinners where she could interrogate me about my life choices. I can finally breathe. That's when the door opened, and we saw our parents standing there while Mom was crying. Mom stood in the doorway, frozen with tears running down her face and makeup smearing into dark streaks. Dad's hand gripped the doorframe so hard his knuckles went white and his whole body looked rigid, like someone had punched all the air out of him. I watched his face cycle through confusion and shock, and then understanding that made his jaw clench tight. 3 years of anger that had kept him away from us started shifting into something different as he processed what Heather had just confessed. His eyes moved from Heather to Mom and back again, while his brain caught up to what his ears had heard. The earring in his car that he'd brought home confused. The phone password he never changed. The dating site emails he never sent. The Boston trip he never booked. All the deleted texts and missed dinners and manufactured evidence that destroyed his marriage. He'd spent 3 years believing his wife didn't trust him, and his family didn't want him when the whole thing was engineered by his oldest daughter. Heather's smile disappeared the second she saw them standing there. Her face went through this rapid transformation from proud to panicked to something defensive and hard. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out, which I'd never seen happen before because Heather always had words and explanations and ways to control every situation. Her perfectly manicured hands clenched into fists at her sides, and her breathing got faster. For someone who spent her whole life manipulating people and staying 3 steps ahead, this was the first time she'd completely lost control of something she created. The coat room felt smaller suddenly, with all of us trapped in here together, and the music still playing outside like nothing had changed. The wedding coordinator appeared behind my parents in the hallway, looking worried and professional. She asked if everything was okay because guests were starting to notice the family had disappeared and people were whispering. I could see past her to the reception hall where my wedding was supposed to be happening. Tables full of people eating appetizers and drinking champagne and dancing to the band Theo and I had spent months picking out. My brain split into 2 directions at once. Part of me wanted to go back out there and pretend this wasn't happening and enjoy my wedding day like I'd planned for a year. The other part knew I couldn't leave this room while my family was falling apart in front of me. My marriage to Theo had just started a few hours ago, and we had our whole lives ahead of us. But my parents' marriage that lasted 28 years was destroyed by lies and manipulation, and they deserved to know the truth, even if it meant my reception happened without me. I told the coordinator we needed a few minutes and she should tell guests we were taking photos or something. She nodded and left, but her face showed she knew something was seriously wrong. The door closed again and we were back in the coat room that smelled like perfume and wool, and now felt like a cage. Heather tried to move toward the door, but Dad stepped further into the room, blocking her path. Mom just stood there crying these quiet tears that were worse than if she'd been sobbing. The band started playing another song, and I recognized it as one from our reception playlist, which made everything feel surreal. 10 minutes passed, and the coat room turned into a war zone. Heather started defending herself, saying nobody understood what it was like living under Mom's constant questions and monitoring. Mom asked how Heather could do this to people who loved her. Dad's voice shook when he spoke, but he wasn't yelling, just asking Heather to explain why. I stood against the wall, feeling my wedding dress get wrinkled from someone's coat, and watched my family have the conversation they should have had 3 years ago. Accusations flew back and forth. Mom brought up specific incidents she now realized were manufactured. Dad asked about the business trip and the dating sites and the changed password. Heather kept saying they didn't understand the pressure she felt, but her voice got less confident as she had to explain each manipulation out loud. That's when Theo found us. He opened the door and took one look at the scene inside, and his face showed he understood this was serious, even though he didn't know details yet. He pulled the coordinator aside, and I heard him quietly tell her to announce the couple was taking a brief break and to keep serving drinks and playing music. Then he came back and stood next to me without asking what was happening, because he knew I'd explain when I could. His hand found mine and squeezed, and I felt grateful I'd married someone who didn't need immediate explanations during a crisis. The coordinator's voice came over the speakers outside, saying the bride and groom would return shortly, and thanking everyone for their patience. Dad's voice cut through the room, asking Heather why she would do this to people who loved her. His hands shook and his voice cracked on certain words. Heather's response came out defensive and rushed. She talked about feeling suffocated and monitored and questioned about every decision, how Mom's protective parenting felt like control and surveillance, how she couldn't breathe under the constant scrutiny of her grades and boyfriends and college choices and career path. She said nobody understood what it was like being the older daughter who got all of Mom's anxiety dumped on her, that I was the favorite who could do nothing wrong while she faced interrogation about every aspect of her life. As she talked, I realized something that made my stomach hurt. Heather genuinely believed she was justified in what she did. She'd convinced herself that destroying a marriage was reasonable payback for having an overprotective mother. Mom made this horrible broken sound and collapsed into a chair someone had left in the corner. Her sobs weren't loud, but they were the kind that come from deep inside when something breaks that can't be fixed easily. The hotel manager appeared at the door, drawn by the noise, and asked if we needed anything. I told him we needed privacy and a bigger space, and he offered us his office away from the reception area. We moved as a group down a service hallway while wedding guests danced and ate and celebrated without us. I could still hear the band playing, and it made everything feel more wrong. My wedding reception was happening without me because my sister destroyed my family and chose my wedding day to confess. The hotel manager's office had a desk and several chairs and windows that looked out at the parking lot. Mom sat in one chair still crying. Dad stood by the window with his back to us. Heather perched on the edge of another chair looking trapped and defensive. Theo stood near the door like he was guarding it, and I realized he was making sure nobody left until this got resolved. The manager brought water bottles and tissues and said to take all the time we needed. Through the walls, I could hear muffled music and laughter from my reception. I told Theo he should go back and make excuses to our guests because they didn't deserve to have their night ruined by family drama they knew nothing about. Theo looked at me and said he wasn't leaving me to deal with this alone. His voice was firm and certain, and I felt something shift in my chest. We'd been married for less than 4 hours, but he was already showing me who he was as a partner. Someone who understood that family crisis doesn't wait for convenient timing. Someone who chose to stand beside me even when it meant missing his own wedding reception. I squeezed his hand and turned back to my family. Heather tried to leave, saying she'd said what she needed to say, and there was nothing more to discuss. Dad moved from the window and blocked the office door. For the first time in 3 years, they were in the same room looking at each other directly. Dad wasn't yelling, though, which surprised me. His voice stayed level when he asked Heather to explain each thing she did. Walk him through every manipulation step by step. Heather looked uncomfortable for the first time as she had to list her actions out loud to the people she'd hurt. The earring, the password, the dating sites, the Boston trip, the deleted messages. Each one sounded worse when she said it in front of Mom and Dad together. Mom stopped crying long enough to ask about my high school graduation. Her voice came out hoarse and broken. She wanted to know if Heather really booked that trip just to make her think Dad chose work over family. Heather hesitated and then admitted she had. She'd used Dad's credit card and email to register him for a conference he didn't know about. Made sure the dates conflicted with my graduation. Wanted Mom to feel abandoned and unimportant. The look on Mom's face when she heard this broke something inside me. That graduation incident had been the beginning of the end for their marriage. The moment Mom started believing Dad didn't care about family. And it was completely manufactured by Heather to create maximum damage. 2 hours into my wedding reception, I was still in the hotel manager's office watching my family process the fact that their divorce was engineered by their own daughter. My phone kept buzzing with texts from the wedding coordinator asking what to do about dinner service and cake cutting and the schedule we'd planned so carefully. Guests were probably wondering where we went. Theo's parents were probably worried. My bridesmaids were definitely confused. But none of that mattered as much as what was happening in this office. I texted the coordinator back and told her to serve dinner and cut the cake without us. Send our apologies, but this couldn't wait. My wedding day was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, but instead it became the day my family finally learned the truth about why they fell apart. Theo stood from his chair and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through something and then looked at me and asked if anyone had eaten anything since the ceremony. Nobody answered because food seemed impossible when our family was falling apart in a hotel office. He stepped into the hallway and came back 5 minutes later saying room service would bring sandwiches and coffee because we couldn't have this conversation while running on empty stomachs and wedding champagne. The practical thinking in the middle of complete chaos made something warm spread through my chest. This man I married 4 hours ago was already showing me exactly who he was as a partner. Someone who thought about basic needs when everyone else was drowning in emotions. Someone who understood that bodies need fuel even when hearts are breaking. He sat back down next to me and took my hand. His palm was warm and steady against mine. The gesture felt like an anchor keeping me from floating away into the mess of accusations and tears filling this room. Dad moved away from the door and sat in the chair furthest from Heather. Mom stayed near the window looking out at the parking lot where wedding guests were probably leaving and wondering where we went. The silence stretched between all of us until the room service cart arrived. Theo answered the door and wheeled it inside. He handed out sandwiches and coffee like we were having a normal family dinner instead of the most important conversation any of us had ever had. I couldn't eat, but I held the warm coffee cup because my hands needed something to do. Mom took a sandwich but just picked at the bread. Dad drank his coffee in long gulps like he was trying to wake up from a nightmare. Heather sat perfectly still with her hands folded in her lap, refusing to take anything Theo offered. Dad set down his coffee cup and looked directly at Mom for the first time. His voice came out quiet and careful when he asked if she ever really believed he would cheat on her. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with 3 years of separation and pain. Mom's hands shook as she lifted her own cup. She took a sip and then another, and I could see her trying to find the right words. She finally admitted she didn't want to believe it. She knew him for 30 years. She knew he loved their family. But the evidence kept showing up. The earring, the password change, the dating site emails, the mysterious trips, the deleted messages. Each thing by itself could be explained, but together they painted a picture she couldn't ignore. Her voice broke when she said she tried to give him chances to explain, but he always seemed confused by her accusations, and that confusion made her think he was lying. Watching them talk about being victims of the same manipulation was worse than watching them fight. They were 3 years too late to fix any of this easily. The divorce was final. They'd both moved on in different ways. Dad had built a life without any of us. Mom had learned to function alone even if she cried herself to sleep most nights. Dad rubbed his face with both hands. He looked older than I remembered. The lines around his eyes were deeper, and his hair had more gray. 3 years of believing his wife thought he was a cheater and liar had aged him. He turned to Heather and asked if she ever considered what this would do to me. To our younger cousins who looked up to our family as an example of what marriage could be. His voice stayed level, but I heard the anger underneath. Heather's perfect mask finally cracked. Her eyes got shiny and her mouth trembled. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, she looked like she might actually feel something real. She opened her mouth and closed it again. Opened it again and said something so quiet I almost missed it. She said she didn't think about collateral damage. She only thought about escaping what felt like constant surveillance and judgment. She only wanted Mom to stop asking questions and checking up on her and making her feel like a child who couldn't be trusted. The tears that fell down her cheeks looked genuine, but I didn't know if I could trust anything about Heather anymore. She'd spent years manipulating all of us. Maybe these tears were just another performance. The hotel office clock showed it was almost midnight when we finally stood up to leave. My legs felt stiff from sitting so long. Theo helped Mom with her coat because her hands were still shaking too much to manage the buttons. Dad held the door open for all of us, and we walked through the quiet hotel hallways toward the lobby. The ballroom where my reception happened was dark now. The tables were cleared. The decorations were being taken down by staff in black uniforms. We'd missed the entire thing. Dinner, cake cutting, first dance, bouquet toss. All the moments I'd planned for months had happened without me there. The wedding coordinator saw us and rushed over. She looked worried and exhausted. She said she saved us a tier of the cake and boxed up all the presents and cards. She'd made sure the photographer got pictures of everything even though we weren't there. She was so kind about the whole disaster that I almost started crying again. I thanked her and she hugged me and whispered that she hoped everything was okay with my family. I nodded because I couldn't explain that nothing was okay and might never be okay again. My wedding day would forever be connected to family destruction instead of celebration. Every time I looked at wedding photos, I'd remember Heather's confession in the coat room. Every anniversary would carry the weight of the night our family learned the truth about the divorce. Theo and I rode the elevator up to our wedding suite while my parents and Heather went to their separate rooms. The hallway was quiet except for our footsteps on the carpet. Theo unlocked the door and we walked into the room decorated with rose petals and champagne that the hotel had set up for us. It looked romantic and special and completely wrong for how I felt. I sat on the edge of the bed, still in my wedding dress. Theo sat next to me and asked if I wanted to change into something more comfortable. I shook my head because taking off the dress felt like admitting the day was really over. We sat there for maybe 20 minutes, not talking, just existing in the same space. Finally, Theo suggested we go out on the balcony because the room felt too small for everything we needed to process. We stepped outside into the cold November air. The city lights spread out below us. Traffic moved on distant streets. Somewhere out there, people were having normal nights with normal problems. Theo asked if I wanted to postpone our honeymoon to Hawaii. The question surprised me because I'd completely forgotten we were supposed to fly out tomorrow morning. How could I get on a plane and leave for a week when my family was in crisis? How could I sit on a beach drinking cocktails while Mom cried over photo albums and Dad processed years of manufactured betrayal? I told Theo I couldn't leave town right now. He nodded like he expected that answer. He pulled out his phone and started looking up the cancellation policy for our flights and hotel. I loved him even more for not arguing or trying to convince me that we deserved our honeymoon. He just accepted what I needed and started figuring out the logistics. We stayed on the balcony until almost 2 a.m. talking about what happens next. Neither of us could sleep. Too much adrenaline. Too many thoughts spinning. Theo asked what I thought my parents would do now that they knew the truth. I said I didn't know. They were divorced. Papers were signed. Property was divided. You can't just undo 3 years because you learned you were manipulated. But maybe they could at least be friends again. Maybe Dad could come back into our lives. Maybe Mom could stop being so depressed. Theo listened without trying to fix anything. He just let me talk through all the possibilities and fears. When I finally ran out of words, he suggested we try to get a few hours of sleep. We went back inside and I let him help me out of my wedding dress. I hung it in the closet where it looked beautiful and sad. I put on the fancy nightgown I'd bought special for tonight, but it felt wrong too. Everything about this night was supposed to be different. The next morning came too fast. Sunlight pushed through the curtains and my phone started buzzing on the nightstand. I grabbed it and saw Mom's name on the screen. Her voice sounded hollow and tired when I answered. She said she didn't sleep at all. She'd been sitting in her house looking at old photo albums trying to figure out which memories were real and which ones were tainted by Heather's manipulation. She kept finding pictures from trips and holidays and asking herself if Dad was really happy in those moments or if he was already dealing with some manufactured crisis Heather had created. Every smile looked suspicious now. Every moment of family togetherness felt like it might have been covering up some argument Heather had engineered. Mom sounded so lost and broken that I made a decision right there on the phone. I told her Theo and I were canceling our honeymoon. We were staying local. She tried to argue and say we shouldn't change our plans, but I cut her off. I told her she needed me and I wasn't going anywhere. After we hung up, I called the airline and canceled our flights. Theo called the Hawaii resort and explained we had a family emergency. They were understanding and said we could rebook later. I felt guilty for ruining our honeymoon, but also relieved that I didn't have to leave. That afternoon, my phone rang again. Dad's name appeared on the screen and I stared at it for several seconds before answering. This was the first time he'd called me in 3 years. The first time he'd initiated contact instead of me leaving messages he ignored. His voice sounded different, older, sadder. He said my name like he wasn't sure he still had the right to call me his daughter. Then his voice broke and he apologized for missing so much of my life. He said he was too angry to separate me from Mom and Heather. He thought if he cut them off, he had to cut me off too, or the anger would destroy him. He missed my college graduation, my new job celebration, my engagement party. 3 years of moments he could never get back. He said learning about Heather's manipulation didn't erase those missed years, but it helped him understand why he felt so betrayed and angry all the time. Every time he tried to fix things with Mom, something else would go wrong and he eventually gave up trying. Now he knew those wrong things were Heather planting more evidence and deleting more messages. I told him I understood and I forgave him for the distance. I said everyone in this family was a victim of what Heather did. We talked for almost an hour about small things. My job, his apartment, the weather. Normal father-daughter conversation we hadn't had in years. When we hung up, I cried because I'd gotten a piece of my dad back, even though the circumstances were terrible. My phone buzzed with a text from Heather. The message was long, paragraphs of explanation about her perspective. She wrote about feeling controlled and monitored her entire childhood, about Mom's constant questions making her feel like she couldn't be trusted, about the pressure to be perfect and successful, about how suffocating it felt to have someone always checking up on her. She said she knew what she did was extreme, but she didn't see another way out. She needed space and freedom, and the only way to get it was to make Mom too depressed to keep hovering. She needed Dad gone, so there wouldn't be family dinners where Mom could interrogate her about life choices. The whole message was justification, defense, explanation. But nowhere did she actually say she was sorry for destroying a marriage and cutting Dad off from his family for 3 years. Nowhere did she acknowledge the pain she caused. I read it 3 times trying to find a real apology, but it wasn't there. I understood her frustration. Mom could be intense about checking up on us, but nothing justified what Heather did to our parents' marriage. Nothing made it okay to manipulate and lie and plant evidence for years. 2 days after my wedding, I met Mom at a coffee shop near her house. She looked tired and smaller somehow, like the weight of learning about Heather's manipulation had physically shrunk her. We ordered coffee and sat in a corner booth away from other customers. Mom pulled out her phone and started showing me things. Bank statements with charges she didn't recognize. Dad's credit card had been used for flowers sent to an address that didn't exist. Hotel reservations in cities where Dad never went. Mom had assumed he was seeing someone else, but now she realized Heather must have made those charges somehow. Mom also told me about mysterious hang-up calls. The phone would ring, and when she answered, nobody would speak. Just breathing and then click. She'd assumed it was Dad's affair partner checking to see if Mom was home. Now she thought it was Heather making calls to increase Mom's paranoia. There was also a woman's scarf left in Dad's car. Expensive silk in a color Mom would never wear. Dad swore he didn't know where it came from. Mom accused him of lying. They fought for weeks about that scarf. Now Mom realized Heather probably planted it. The scope of the manipulation was staggering. Every incident Mom described revealed more planning and intention. Heather hadn't acted on impulse. She'd crafted a multi-year campaign to destroy their marriage. Theo's parents called that evening to check on us. I answered, and his mom asked how Hawaii was. I had to explain that we canceled the trip, that we were still in town dealing with family crisis. She asked what happened, and I gave her the basic story. My sister confessed at the wedding reception that she deliberately destroyed my parents' marriage through years of manipulation. His mom made shocked noises and asked if I was serious. I confirmed it was all true. His dad got on the phone and said that was one of the most disturbing things he'd ever heard. He asked if our family was getting help. I said we were trying to figure that out. He told me he knew a family therapist named Rowan Burke, who specialized in rebuilding trust after betrayal. He'd worked with her years ago when his own family went through something difficult. He said he'd send me her contact information. I thanked him and felt grateful that Theo came from a family who understood that sometimes you need professional help to fix complicated problems. 3 days passed like moving through mud. I kept replaying the coat room scene in my head while trying to act normal around Theo. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't push. On Thursday afternoon, I texted Heather asking if I could come over. She responded an hour later saying she had time at 6. I took the subway to her building in the financial district, and the doorman called up to announce me like I was some stranger instead of her sister. Her penthouse took up the entire top floor with floor-to-ceiling windows showing the city lights. She opened the door wearing yoga pants and an expensive sweater. Her hair was pulled back and she looked tired. I walked past her into the living room with its white furniture and abstract art that probably cost more than my car. She offered me wine and I said no because I needed to stay clear-headed for this conversation. We sat on opposite ends of her couch and she waited for me to speak first. I asked if she'd talked to Mom or Dad since the wedding and she said no. I asked if she planned to and she shrugged like it didn't matter. Then I asked her directly if she understood what she'd done to our family. She got defensive immediately. Her voice went up and she started talking fast about how I didn't understand what it was like being the older daughter. How Mom put all her anxiety and pressure on Heather first. How every decision got questioned and analyzed. How she felt like she couldn't breathe without Mom asking where she was going and when she'd be back and who she'd be with. I listened without interrupting because I wanted to hear her full explanation. She talked about feeling suffocated and controlled. About how Mom's constant checking felt like she didn't trust Heather to make good choices. About how the questions never stopped even after Heather moved out and got her own place. She said I wouldn't understand because I was the baby who could do nothing wrong. I let her finish, and then I asked her one question. Did she ever consider just talking to Mom about feeling suffocated instead of destroying a 28-year marriage? She stopped mid-sentence and stared at me. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. I waited. Finally, she admitted that never occurred to her. She said she was so used to manipulating situations to get what she wanted that honest communication wasn't even an option she thought about. She said it like it was normal. Like everyone solved problems by creating elaborate schemes instead of having difficult conversations. I asked her if she realized that made her sound like a sociopath and she got angry. She stood up and started pacing. She said I was being dramatic and that she just did what she needed to do to get space from Mom's hovering. I stayed sitting because I knew if I stood up, this would turn into a screaming match. My phone rang while we were talking. It was Mom. I answered and heard her crying before she even said hello. She asked if I could come over right away. I said yes and hung up. Heather asked what was wrong and I told her Mom needed me. She rolled her eyes and said of course Mom needed something. I left without saying goodbye. Mom's house looked the same as always, but somehow sadder. The plants on the porch needed watering and the paint was starting to peel. She opened the door with red eyes and tissues in her hand. We went to the kitchen and she made tea neither of us drank. She pulled out her laptop and showed me her email account. She'd been going through old folders looking for something else and found a folder she didn't recognize. It was hidden in her archived mail and labeled with a random string of numbers. Inside were dozens of emails from Dad. Apologies for things he never did. Explanations for misunderstandings that never got resolved. Dinner plans she never saw. Anniversary messages. Birthday wishes. Every single one was from the years leading up to the divorce. Mom was shaking as she scrolled through them. She said she never received any of these emails. She would have remembered. She would have responded. But they were all marked as read even though she never read them. Heather must have accessed her email account somehow and moved them to this hidden folder, so Mom would never see them. Every attempt Dad made to fix things got intercepted and destroyed. Mom kept saying she could have saved the marriage if she'd just seen these emails. If she'd known he was trying. If she'd understood he wasn't actually avoiding her or choosing work over family. I didn't know what to say. The scope of Heather's manipulation kept getting bigger. Mom asked if I knew about this, and I said no. She asked if I thought Heather did other things too, and I said probably. We sat there in her kitchen, surrounded by evidence of a marriage that could have been saved. The next morning I was making coffee when I remembered something. 3 years ago, Dad sent me a birthday card. Mom told me it never arrived, but she'd forward it when it showed up. It never did. Same thing happened at Christmas. Mom said the post office must have lost the packages. But now I wondered if they ever made it to Mom's house at all. I called her and asked if she still had the mail from that time period. She said she kept everything in boxes in the garage because she couldn't bring herself to throw away anything from that year. I drove over and we spent 2 hours going through old mail. No cards, no packages, nothing from Dad. But Mom found something else. A stack of return-to-sender envelopes addressed to her from Dad's apartment. She never sent him anything, so why would mail be returned? We opened them and found cards and letters she supposedly sent him. Angry letters. Mean letters. Letters telling him to stop contacting us and leave us alone. Mom started crying again because she never wrote any of these. Her handwriting was similar, but not exact. Heather must have written them and mailed them from Mom's address. Every time Dad tried to reach out, he got a hostile response he thought was from Mom. No wonder he eventually stopped trying. No wonder he thought we hated him. Heather had built a wall between our parents made of fake emails and forged letters and intercepted mail. She'd made sure every attempt at reconciliation failed. 1 week after the wedding, I finally worked up the courage to call Dad. He answered on the 4th ring, and his voice sounded uncertain when he said hello. I told him it was me and asked if we could meet for lunch. Just the two of us. No Mom, no Heather. He was quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up. Then he said okay. We met at a diner halfway between his apartment and my place. I got there first and watched him walk in. He looked older than I remembered. His hair was more gray. His shoulders were more stooped. He'd lost weight. He saw me and smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. We ordered food neither of us wanted and sat across from each other, not knowing how to start. Finally, he asked how married life was treating me. I said it was good but complicated. He nodded like he understood. Then I told him about the emails Mom found, about the letters that came back, about the birthday cards and Christmas presents that never made it through. His face went through about 10 different expressions while I talked. Confusion, disbelief, understanding, anger, grief. He put his head in his hands and just sat there. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. He told me about the loneliness of being cut off from his family while not understanding what he did wrong. How he'd replay conversations in his head trying to figure out where everything went bad. How he'd call and get sent to voicemail. How he'd email and get hostile responses. How he'd send cards and never hear back. He said he felt like he was going crazy because he couldn't figure out what he'd done that was so terrible his whole family would cut him off. Now he knew it wasn't him. It was Heather. Making sure every bridge got burned. Every connection got severed. Every attempt at communication failed. Dad told me he eventually stopped trying because every attempt seemed to make things worse. He thought maybe we were better off without him. Maybe he was toxic somehow and didn't realize it. Maybe the best thing he could do for his family was stay away. Learning that Heather sabotaged everything made him angry all over again, but this time the anger had a clear target. He asked me how long this went on and I said years. He asked me why and I explained about Heather feeling suffocated by Mom's hovering. He stared at me like I was speaking another language. He said feeling annoyed by a parent's questions didn't justify destroying a marriage and cutting a father off from his children. I agreed. He asked if Heather showed any remorse and I said no, not really. He pushed his untouched food away and said he didn't know if he could forgive her. I said I understood. He asked about Mom and I told him she was devastated. He asked if she wanted to talk to him and I said I thought so, but I wasn't sure. We sat there for another hour just talking about random things. My job. His job. The apartment he'd been living in. The life he'd built without us. It felt good to talk to him again even though the circumstances were awful. Before we left, I suggested family therapy. Dad's reaction was immediate. He said no. He said he wasn't ready to be in the same room with Heather without losing his temper. He said he needed time to process everything before he could face her. I understood, but I also knew we couldn't heal if everyone stayed separated and angry. I told him that, and he said maybe some things can't be healed. Maybe some damage is permanent. I didn't want to believe that, but I couldn't argue with him. He'd lost 3 years with his daughters because of Heather's manipulation. That time was gone. We couldn't get it back. We hugged in the parking lot, and he held on longer than necessary. He told me he was glad I reached out and that he wanted to stay in touch. I said I wanted that too. Driving home, I felt this weird mix of happy and sad. Happy because I had my dad back in some way. Sad because of everything we'd lost. Mom started seeing a therapist the following week. She told me about it over coffee at the same place we'd met before. Her therapist was helping her process the manipulation and her depression. But the therapist also said something that made Mom uncomfortable. She suggested that Mom's protective parenting might have been excessive, even if it didn't justify Heather's response. Mom got defensive when she told me this. She said she was just being a good mother. She said she was keeping us safe. She said parents are supposed to know where their kids are and who they're with. I agreed, but I also said there's a difference between caring and controlling. Mom didn't like that. She said I was taking Heather's side. I explained I wasn't taking anyone's side, but that maybe both things could be true. Maybe Mom was overprotective and maybe Heather's response was still completely wrong. Mom went quiet. Then she asked if I thought she drove Heather to do this. I said no. I said Heather made her own choices, and those choices were manipulative and cruel. But I also said that understanding why someone feels a certain way doesn't mean excusing what they did. Mom nodded, but I could tell she was going to be thinking about this for a long time. That night, Theo and I had our first real fight. We were making dinner, and he said maybe we should distance ourselves from my family drama for a while. I stopped chopping vegetables and stared at him. I asked what he meant. He said he was worried about me. that I was spending all my time and energy trying to fix my family, and it was taking a toll. That we were supposed to be newlyweds enjoying our first months of marriage, but instead I was constantly stressed and upset. I told him I couldn't just abandon my parents when they were struggling. He said he wasn't asking me to abandon them, just to set some boundaries. I said this wasn't something I could put boundaries around. My sister destroyed my parents' marriage. My dad was isolated for 3 years. My mom was manipulated and lied to. This wasn't drama. This was serious. He said he knew it was serious, and that's exactly why he was worried. I asked if he regretted marrying me, and he looked shocked. He said of course not. He said he loved me, and he was just worried about me taking on everyone's pain. We both apologized. He said he should have been more supportive. I said I should have been paying more attention to us instead of just my family. We agreed to try to find better balance, but I knew that was going to be hard. 2 weeks after the wedding, I went back to work. My coworkers immediately asked about the honeymoon. I'd been dreading this. I made up a story about changing plans because of a family emergency. I kept it vague. They asked follow-up questions, and I deflected. My boss noticed I was distracted during our team meeting. She pulled me aside afterward and asked if everything was okay at home. I said it was fine, just some family stuff. She looked at me like she knew I was lying, but she didn't push. She just said if I needed time off or needed to talk, her door was open. I thanked her and went back to my desk. Sitting there trying to focus on spreadsheets and emails felt impossible. My mind kept drifting to Dad sitting alone in his apartment, to Mom going through old emails looking for evidence of the marriage she lost, to Heather in her expensive penthouse probably not even thinking about the damage she'd caused. I didn't know how to be normal anymore. I didn't know how to care about quarterly reports and project deadlines when my family was falling apart. But I also couldn't quit my job or fall apart at work. So I did what I had to do. I focused on my computer screen and pretended everything was fine. I got home from work that evening and found Theo sitting on the couch looking uncomfortable. He said Heather had shown up an hour ago and knocked for 10 minutes straight before he finally answered. She wanted to come in and wait for me, but he told her I wasn't ready for that yet. She'd gotten angry and said he was keeping her from her own sister. He'd stood in the doorway blocking her and said I needed space. She'd called him controlling and said he was turning me against my family. Then she'd left, but not before saying this wasn't over. I sat down next to him and thanked him for handling it. He asked if I was okay, and I said I didn't know. Part of me wanted to see Heather and demand better answers. Part of me never wanted to see her again. He squeezed my hand and said whatever I decided, he'd support me. The next morning, my phone rang while I was making coffee. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A man's voice said my name and asked if I had a minute to talk. I said yes, even though I had no idea who this was. He introduced himself as Uncle Caleb, Dad's younger brother. I hadn't heard from him in years because he lived across the country and our family had fallen apart. He said Dad had finally told him everything about what Heather did. His voice was shaking when he said he couldn't believe his niece had destroyed a marriage on purpose. He'd known something was wrong when Dad stopped coming to family events and wouldn't explain why. Now it all made sense. He asked how I was holding up, and I started crying because nobody had asked me that in weeks. Everyone was so focused on Mom and Dad and what Heather did that nobody noticed I was drowning too. He listened while I talked about the wedding and the confession and trying to hold everyone together. Then he offered to help facilitate conversations between family members. He said he'd maintained relationships with everyone over the years and wasn't directly involved in the conflict. Maybe he could be a neutral person who helped us communicate. I agreed immediately because I needed help and didn't know where else to get it. 2 days later, Mom called me sobbing. She'd been cleaning out the attic looking for old tax documents when she found a box of Heather's things from college. Inside were journals that Heather had kept during her sophomore and junior years. Mom had started reading them, hoping to understand her daughter better. What she found made her sick. Entry after entry about feeling controlled and monitored. About Mom's constant questions and check-ins being suffocating. About wanting freedom and independence and not knowing how to get it. Then the entries shifted. Heather started writing about making Mom and Dad fight more. About small things she could do to create distance between them. She'd written out plans for planting evidence and manufacturing conflicts. She'd documented her progress like it was a school project. Mom read me some of the entries over the phone. One said Mom was too wrapped up in everyone's business and needed something else to focus on, like a failing marriage. Another said Dad was too trusting and would never suspect his own daughter of sabotage. The detail and planning were scary. This wasn't impulsive anger. This was calculated destruction over years. Mom said she couldn't stop reading even though every page made her feel worse. She kept hoping to find an entry where Heather regretted what she'd done or realized she'd gone too far. But those entries never came. The journals just stopped when Heather graduated and moved out. Mom's voice broke when she said she didn't recognize the person who wrote those words. That wasn't the daughter she'd raised. I tried to comfort her, but what could I say? Her daughter had planned the destruction of her marriage in writing and never felt bad about it. Mom said she needed to adjust her medication because she couldn't sleep or eat. Her therapist had warned her about depression spirals, and this was definitely one. 3 weeks after my wedding, I finally agreed to meet Heather again. Uncle Caleb had called both of us and suggested a mediated conversation. He'd rented a small conference room at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where neither of us would feel ambushed. I got there first and sat facing the door. Uncle Caleb arrived next. He was tall with gray hair and Dad's same eyes. He hugged me and said he was sorry this was happening. Then Heather walked in carrying a leather folder. She looked tired and her makeup wasn't as perfect as usual. She sat across from me without making eye contact. Uncle Caleb started by setting ground rules. No yelling, no interrupting. Everyone gets to speak without being attacked. Then he asked Heather if she wanted to explain her perspective. She opened her folder and pulled out printed articles. She slid them across the table toward me and Uncle Caleb. They were articles about helicopter parenting and emotional abuse, about controlling parents and the psychological damage they cause, about children who grow up feeling suffocated and monitored. Heather said she'd been researching this for years, that what Mom did wasn't normal protective parenting. It was excessive control that damaged her mental health and her ability to develop independence. She pointed to specific paragraphs that described behaviors Mom had done, the constant check-ins, the calls to verify stories, the questions about every decision. She said she'd tried to talk to Mom about it when she was younger, but Mom never listened. Mom just said she was being dramatic or ungrateful. So Heather had found another way to get the freedom she needed. Uncle Caleb listened carefully, then asked if Heather understood the difference between feeling controlled and actually being abused. Heather got defensive and said the articles proved it was real. He said the articles described concerning behavior, but that didn't justify destroying a marriage. Heather's face went red and she said nobody understood what it was like being her. I took a breath and told Heather that even if Mom was overprotective, the appropriate response was therapy or honest conversation. Not systematically destroying a marriage and cutting Dad off from his family for 3 years. Heather snapped back that I didn't get it because I was always Mom's favorite. The baby who could do nothing wrong while she got all the pressure and expectations. I said that wasn't true, but Heather talked over me. She listed every time Mom had been harder on her than on me. Every time Mom had questioned her choices but praised mine. Every time Mom had worried about her grades or her friends or her decisions while giving me freedom. I listened to her list and realized some of it was probably true. Mom had been more anxious with Heather. But I also knew that's what happens with first kids. Parents are more nervous and make more mistakes. That didn't excuse what Heather had done. I told her that and she stood up like she was going to leave. Uncle Caleb asked her to sit back down. He said we needed to work through this, not run away from it. Heather sat, but she looked angry. Uncle Caleb looked at Heather and said something that made the room go quiet. He pointed out that Heather's current success and independence proved she'd survived Mom's parenting just fine. She'd gotten into Yale, she had a great job, she owned a penthouse, she had the freedom and control over her life that she'd always wanted. Maybe the real issue wasn't Mom's parenting. Maybe the real issue was that Heather couldn't admit she was wrong. That she'd taken her frustration too far and destroyed people who loved her. Heather's face went from red to white. She grabbed her folder and stood up so fast her chair fell over. She said Uncle Caleb didn't know anything about her life, that he hadn't been there for the years of constant monitoring and control, that nobody in this family understood what she'd been through. Then she walked out. Uncle Caleb and I sat there in silence. He said he was sorry that didn't go better. I said at least we tried. But I knew Heather wasn't ready to admit what she'd done was wrong. Maybe she never would be. A week later, Uncle Caleb called to say Dad had agreed to meet with Mom. First time in 3 years they'd be in the same room. Uncle Caleb suggested doing it at my apartment with him and me there as support. I agreed, even though the idea made me nervous. I cleaned my apartment 3 times. Theo helped me rearrange furniture so there'd be enough seating. We put out coffee and snacks even though I doubted anyone would eat. Mom arrived first. She looked small and scared. She sat on one end of the couch and folded her hands in her lap. Dad came 15 minutes later. He stood in the doorway looking at Mom like he wasn't sure she was real. Uncle Caleb guided him to the chair across from her. They sat on opposite sides of my living room looking at each other like strangers. I could see 3 years of silence in the space between them. All the words they hadn't said. All the explanations that never happened. All the manufactured fights and fake evidence that had convinced them to hate each other. Uncle Caleb started by reminding them why we were here. To talk about what Heather had done and figure out how to move forward. Dad spoke first. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it much. He said he'd been so angry for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to not be angry. When he found out Heather had manipulated everything, the anger had shifted, but it hadn't gone away. Now he was angry at her instead of at Mom. But he was also angry at himself for believing the lies so easily, for giving up on his marriage without fighting harder. Mom started crying quietly. She said she was sorry for believing the evidence Heather had planted. Sorry for doubting Dad when he denied everything. Sorry for letting her suspicions destroy what they'd built together. Dad's eyes filled with tears, and he said he was sorry too. Sorry for shutting everyone out for 3 years. Sorry for missing so much of my life and Mom's life. Sorry for not trying harder to figure out what was really going on. They were both crying now, and I could see they still cared about each other. But I could also see that too much had happened. 3 years of silence and pain and separate lives. They couldn't just go back to being married like nothing had changed. The damage was too deep. Uncle Caleb asked if they wanted to try being friends, if they could rebuild some kind of relationship even if it wasn't romantic. Dad said he'd like that. Mom nodded and said she would too. They talked for 2 more hours about small things. Memories from when we were kids. Updates on their separate lives. Careful conversations that avoided the biggest wounds. When they left, they hugged goodbye. It was awkward and brief, but it was something. Uncle Caleb stayed after they'd gone and told me I'd done a good thing bringing them together. I wasn't sure. They were talking again, but they were still broken. 1 month after my wedding, Theo and I finally took a long weekend trip to the mountains. We'd postponed our honeymoon, but we needed to get away from everything. We drove 3 hours to a cabin rental surrounded by pine trees. No cell service, no family drama, just us and the quiet. We hiked during the day and sat by the fire at night. On the second evening, Theo asked how I was really doing with everything. I'd been avoiding that question even from myself. I told him I was angry at Heather. Angry that she'd destroyed our family because she felt controlled. But I was also heartbroken for everyone involved. For Mom, who'd been manipulated into believing her husband was cheating. For Dad, who'd lost 3 years with his family. For Heather, who was so convinced she was right that she couldn't see the damage she'd caused. Theo listened and held my hand. He said it was okay to feel multiple things at once. That I didn't have to pick a side or have all the answers. We sat there watching the fire, and I felt some of the tension leave my body. The distance from everything helped me see it more clearly. My family was broken, but we were trying to heal. That was something. When we got back home and turned our phones on, I had 7 missed calls from Mom. I called her back, immediately worried something had happened. She said Heather's boss had called her in for a conversation about ethical behavior. Apparently, word about what Heather had done had spread through family and friends. Someone who knew someone at Heather's company had mentioned it. The boss wanted to know if the rumors were true that Heather had deliberately destroyed her parents' marriage through manipulation and lies. Heather had tried to deny it, but the boss said the story was too specific and too consistent across multiple sources. The company valued integrity and ethical behavior. They couldn't have someone on staff who'd engaged in that level of calculated deception, even if it was personal, not professional. Heather hadn't been fired, but she'd been told her behavior was watched. She'd lost a major client whose wife had heard about the situation and refused to work with her. Her professional reputation was taking hits she hadn't expected. Mom said Heather had called her crying about it, asking Mom to help fix her reputation. Mom had said no, that Heather needed to face the consequences of her choices. I hung up feeling complicated. Part of me was glad Heather was facing real consequences. Part of me felt bad that her whole life was affected. But mostly I felt tired. Tired of the drama and the pain and the constant crisis. I just wanted my family to be okay again. 2 days later, Mom called to tell me she and Dad were meeting for coffee. Just the 2 of them. No lawyers or mediators or family members watching. She sounded nervous, but also something else. Hopeful, maybe. I asked if she was sure that was a good idea, and she said probably not. But they needed to talk without everyone else adding their opinions. Dad had texted her asking to meet, and she'd said yes before she could talk herself out of it. They picked a coffee shop halfway between their places. Neutral ground. I wanted to be there, but Mom said this was something they needed to do alone. So I stayed home and checked my phone every 10 minutes like that would make her call faster. Theo caught me staring at my phone for the 5th time in 20 minutes and took it away from me. He said they'd call when they were ready and worrying wouldn't help. He was right, but that didn't stop my brain from running through every possible disaster scenario. 3 hours passed before Mom finally called. Her voice sounded different, lighter. She said the coffee meeting went better than expected. They talked about what Heather had done and how neither of them had known they were being played against each other. Dad admitted he'd believed all the manufactured evidence because he was working too much and felt guilty about it. Mom admitted she'd believed it because she was anxious about everything and always expected the worst. They weren't blaming themselves anymore, though. They were just trying to understand how it happened. Mom said Dad looked older and tired, but also relieved to finally know the truth. They'd talked about specific incidents. The earring in the car, the dating site emails, the missed graduation. Each time they compared notes, they found more pieces that didn't make sense until you knew Heather was behind it all. Dad had kept every confused text message Mom never responded to. Mom had screenshots of hostile emails she thought Dad sent. When they looked at the evidence together, it was obvious someone had been interfering. The timeline was too perfect. Too many coincidences that pushed them apart at exactly the wrong moments. Uncle Caleb's suggestion about weekly meetings came up, and they both agreed to try it. Not to get back together. That ship had sailed, and they both knew it. But to rebuild some kind of friendship. To stop being strangers who used to love each other. Mom said it felt weird talking to Dad like a person again instead of the enemy who destroyed their family. Because he wasn't the enemy. Heather was. And they'd both been her victims. The next morning, I called Anastasia, Heather's college roommate from freshman and sophomore year. We'd met a few times at family events but hadn't talked in years. I found her number through social media and texted first asking if she had time to talk. She called back within an hour. I explained what had happened at my wedding and asked if she'd noticed anything similar when she lived with Heather. Anastasia got quiet for a long minute. Then she said yes. She'd noticed. Heather had a talent for creating problems between people and then solving them. Their sophomore year, Heather had convinced Anastasia that their other roommate was stealing from her. Small things at first. A hair tie, some quarters from a jar. Then bigger things like a necklace and some cash. Anastasia confronted the roommate who denied everything and seemed genuinely confused. The accusations caused huge fights. The roommate moved out mid-semester. 2 years later, Anastasia found the stolen necklace in a box of Heather's things she'd left behind. She'd confronted Heather about it, and Heather had laughed it off, saying the roommate probably planted it there to make Heather look bad. But Anastasia knew. She knew Heather had taken the stuff and framed the other girl just to get her to leave. When I asked why, Anastasia said Heather didn't like sharing space or attention. The other roommate was popular and social, and Heather hated that, so she manufactured a reason to get rid of her. Anastasia also mentioned that Heather was always skilled at reading people and knowing exactly what buttons to push. She could make you doubt yourself without you realizing she was doing it. Little comments about your judgment or your memory. Subtle suggestions that maybe you were wrong about what you saw or heard. It was so gradual you didn't notice until you were second-guessing everything. I asked if Anastasia thought Heather had done this kind of thing before our parents, and she said definitely. Heather had caused drama between other friends. Between her boyfriend and his roommate. Between her study group members. Always positioning herself as the reasonable one trying to help while secretly making everything worse. Anastasia said she'd distanced herself from Heather junior year because being around her felt exhausting. Like you always had to watch what you said and did because it might get twisted later. I thanked her for being honest, and she said she was sorry about my parents, that she wished she'd said something years ago, but she hadn't realized the pattern was that serious. We hung up and I sat there processing what I'd learned. Heather had been doing this for at least a decade, maybe longer. This wasn't a one-time thing she did because Mom was annoying. This was who she was. 5 weeks after my wedding, we had our first family therapy session. Rowan Burke's office was in a medical building downtown. Beige walls and comfortable chairs and a white noise machine outside the door. I got there early with Theo. Mom arrived 10 minutes later looking nervous. Dad showed up right on time. Uncle Caleb came last because he'd gotten stuck in traffic. We all sat in Rowan's waiting room not talking much. Just existing in the same space and trying not to think too hard about why we were there. Rowan came out at exactly 3 o'clock. She was younger than I expected, maybe 40. Dark hair pulled back, kind eyes but also sharp like she didn't miss anything. She shook everyone's hand and invited us into her office. The room was bigger than the waiting area with windows overlooking the street. We arranged ourselves on 2 couches facing each other, Mom and Dad on opposite couches, me and Theo together, Uncle Caleb in a chair between them like a buffer. Rowan sat in her own chair with a notepad and asked us to introduce ourselves and explain why we were there. I started because nobody else seemed ready to talk. I explained the wedding confession, Heather's admission about destroying the marriage, the 3 years of estrangement, the manipulation tactics we'd discovered. Rowan listened without interrupting and took notes. When I finished, she asked Mom and Dad if they wanted to add anything. Dad said he wanted to understand how he'd missed the signs. Mom said she wanted to stop feeling like an idiot for believing the lies. Uncle Caleb said he wanted to help his brother reconnect with his family. Rowan nodded and said those were all valid goals. She asked where Heather was, and I explained she'd refused to come. Rowan said that was unfortunate but not unexpected. People who manipulate others rarely want to participate in processes that hold them accountable. We could still work on family healing without her, though. It would just look different. She asked us to talk about what we wanted from therapy. Dad said he wanted to process his anger without letting it control him. Mom said she wanted to stop blaming herself for being manipulated. I said I wanted my family to be okay again, even if okay looked different from before. Uncle Caleb said he wanted to support everyone through this. Rowan wrote everything down and said those were achievable goals if we committed to the work. Rowan started by addressing Mom directly. She said one of the hardest parts of this situation was that Mom was going to blame herself, even though the manipulation wasn't her fault. Mom nodded and her eyes filled with tears. Rowan continued saying that Heather's actions came from real pain. Feeling suffocated and controlled by anxious parenting was a genuine experience. But the response was completely inappropriate and disproportionate. Both things could be true at the same time. Mom could acknowledge that maybe her anxiety made her too protective, while also recognizing that nothing she did justified what Heather chose to do. This framework seemed to help Mom sit up straighter. She'd been carrying guilt about her parenting for weeks, thinking if she'd just been different, Heather wouldn't have done this. But Rowan was saying she could hold Heather accountable while still examining her own behavior. They weren't mutually exclusive. Dad asked how he was supposed to forgive someone who stole 3 years of his life. Rowan said forgiveness wasn't required for healing. That was important. He didn't have to forgive Heather. He just had to process his anger in ways that didn't destroy him. Anger was a valid response to betrayal. The question was what he did with it. Did he let it consume him, or did he use it as information about his boundaries and values? Dad seemed relieved by this, like he'd been worried therapy would force him to forgive and forget. Rowan explained that healing meant accepting what happened and finding ways to move forward. It didn't mean pretending everything was fine or that the damage didn't matter. We talked for another 40 minutes about specific incidents and how they'd affected each person. Mom described waiting at restaurants alone thinking Dad had stood her up. Dad described the confusion of being accused of things he didn't do. I described watching my family fall apart and not understanding why. Uncle Caleb described maintaining contact with Dad while the rest of the family cut him off and feeling torn between both sides. Rowan listened to all of it and helped us see patterns we'd missed. How Heather had isolated Dad specifically. How she'd fed Mom's anxiety while making Dad look uncaring. How she'd kept everyone separated so they couldn't compare notes. The manipulation was sophisticated and deliberate, not something that happened by accident. At the end of the session, Rowan gave us homework. She wanted me to start documenting everything I'd learned about Heather's tactics, not to use against her, but to help me process the betrayal and see patterns I'd missed. She wanted Mom and Dad to keep having their coffee meetings and practicing honest communication. She wanted Uncle Caleb to continue being a neutral support for everyone. We scheduled another session for 2 weeks later and left the office feeling drained but also slightly hopeful. Like maybe we could actually heal from this. I started the documentation project that night, opened a new document on my laptop and began listing everything chronologically. The earring incident, the password change, the dating sites, the fake business trip, the deleted messages. As I wrote it all out, the scope became clear. Heather had been working on this for years, probably since high school based on what Anastasia had said. Each incident built on the previous one, creating a pattern of distrust that eventually destroyed the marriage. I added notes about timing. How Heather had escalated during stressful periods when Mom and Dad were already struggling. How she'd targeted Dad's work commitments and Mom's anxiety. How she'd used my high school graduation as a weapon knowing how much it would hurt Mom. The timeline was shocking, so thorough and planned. This wasn't impulsive anger. This was calculated destruction spread over years. I saved the document and sent a copy to Rowan like she'd asked. Then I closed my laptop and sat there feeling sick. My sister had done this. My sister who I'd looked up to. Who I'd thought was perfect and successful and had everything figured out. She'd spent years destroying our family because she didn't like being asked about homework. 3 days later, Mom called me crying. She'd been going through old emails trying to find things Dad had mentioned sending. She'd found a folder she didn't recognize, hidden in her account settings. Inside were hundreds of emails, messages from Dad that she'd never seen, apologies, explanations, dinner invitations, birthday wishes, all marked as read, but moved to this hidden folder automatically. Mom realized Heather must have set up a filter rule in her email account. Anything from Dad's address got automatically hidden. Mom never saw any of it. She'd thought Dad was ignoring her, refusing to communicate or work on their marriage. But he'd been trying the whole time. She just never received the messages. Mom also found sent emails she didn't write. Hostile responses to Dad's attempts at reconciliation. Messages telling him to stop contacting her. Threats to call lawyers if he didn't leave her alone. All sent from Mom's account but written by Heather. Dad had screenshots of these emails. He'd shown them to his lawyer during the divorce as proof that Mom wanted no contact, but Mom had never written them. Never even seen them until now. She'd been framed in her own email account. The manipulation was even more elaborate than we'd thought. Heather hadn't just deleted messages. She'd impersonated Mom to push Dad away. She'd created entire conversations that never happened. Made Dad think Mom hated him while making Mom think Dad had abandoned her. All while sitting in her penthouse apartment managing her successful career and feeling proud of herself for escaping Mom's questions about her life. 6 weeks after my wedding, Heather finally agreed to attend therapy. She'd been ignoring my calls and Mom's messages, but Rowan had sent her a letter explaining that family healing required everyone's participation. Heather called me and said she'd come to one session. Just one. And only if she could explain her side first. I agreed because getting her there at all felt like progress. The day of the session, I arrived early again. Mom and Dad were already in the waiting room sitting on opposite sides. Uncle Caleb came in behind me. We waited. 3 o'clock came and went. Rowan stepped out and asked if Heather was coming. I texted her and she responded saying she was parking. 10 minutes later, she walked in wearing her work clothes. Expensive suit. Perfect makeup. She looked at all of us and her expression was defensive. Rowan invited us all into the office and we took the same seats as before. Heather sat alone on the couch opposite everyone else. Rowan thanked her for coming and asked if she wanted to start by sharing her perspective like she'd requested. Heather nodded and launched into her explanation. She talked about feeling suffocated growing up, how Mom's constant questions and check-ins made her feel controlled and monitored, how she couldn't make any decision without Mom questioning it, how other kids' parents weren't like that, and she felt embarrassed by the level of oversight. She talked about feeling like Mom's anxiety was projected onto her, how Mom's fears became Heather's prison, how she'd tried talking to Mom about it, but Mom just said she was protecting her. Heather said she felt like she had no autonomy, no privacy, no trust, just endless interrogation about every aspect of her life. She talked for 20 minutes straight. Nobody interrupted. We just listened to her describe years of feeling trapped by Mom's love. When Heather finished, Rowan let the silence sit for a moment. Then she asked a question. She asked Heather if she understood the difference between feeling controlled and actually being abused. Heather looked confused. Rowan explained that feeling suffocated by protective parenting was valid. Many young adults felt that way, but there was a difference between uncomfortable oversight and actual abuse. Heather's response to that discomfort was to systematically destroy her parents' marriage through years of calculated manipulation. Was that response proportionate to the situation? Heather opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out. She looked around the room like she was expecting someone to back her up. Nobody did. Rowan asked again. Was manufacturing evidence of infidelity proportionate to being asked about homework? Was isolating her father from his family proportionate to having her sleepover stories verified? Was impersonating her mother in emails proportionate to feeling embarrassed by parental concern? Heather's face changed. The defensive certainty cracked. She said it wasn't about just homework. It was about everything. The constant pressure and questions and monitoring. Rowan nodded and said she heard that. But the question remained. Was her response proportionate? Heather struggled to answer. She kept trying to explain her feelings, but Rowan gently redirected her back to the question. Finally, Heather said she didn't know. Maybe not. But she'd felt so trapped. Rowan said feeling trapped didn't justify trapping others. Feeling controlled didn't justify controlling an entire family's narrative for years. Heather needed to sit with that reality. Dad spoke for the first time since Heather arrived. His voice was steady, but you could hear the pain underneath. He said he'd lost 3 years with his daughters. Missed my engagement. Missed helping me plan my wedding. Missed holidays and birthdays and regular phone calls. He'd missed being a father because Heather decided he didn't deserve that role anymore. And that pain didn't disappear just because he now understood why it happened. Understanding didn't erase the loss. Heather looked at Dad, and for the first time since the wedding, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. Not defensive, not proud, just uncomfortable. Like she was finally seeing the damage from someone else's perspective. Dad continued. He said he'd spent 3 years thinking his family hated him. Thinking he'd somehow destroyed his marriage without understanding how. The confusion and isolation had been devastating. And all of it was manufactured by his own daughter because she didn't like being asked where she was going on Friday nights. Heather's eyes filled with tears. Real ones, not manipulative ones. She whispered that she was sorry. Dad said sorry didn't fix it. Sorry didn't give him back those years. But it was a start. We sat in that heavy silence for a long time. Rowan finally spoke and said this was important progress. Heather was starting to see beyond her own experience. That was the first step toward real accountability. We had a lot more work to do, but this session had moved us forward. We scheduled another appointment for the following week and filed out of the office. Heather left first, walking quickly to her car. The rest of us stood in the parking lot, not sure what to say. Finally, Mom said she needed to go home and process everything. Dad nodded and said he did too. We all went our separate ways, but something had shifted. Heather's certainty had cracked. And that crack was the first real opening toward healing. The next therapy session happened 2 days later, and Mom showed up early. She sat in the waiting room with her hands folded in her lap, looking nervous, like she was preparing for something important. When Heather arrived, she looked surprised to see Mom already there, but she sat down across from her anyway. Rowan came out and invited us all in, and we took our usual seats in the circle. Mom cleared her throat and looked directly at Heather for the first time without anger or tears clouding her expression. She asked if Heather ever stopped to think about why she asked so many questions and checked in so often. Heather started to give her standard response about feeling controlled, but Mom held up her hand and kept talking. She explained that when Heather was born, the doctor said she might have complications, and Mom spent the first year terrified something would go wrong. That fear never really left even when Heather grew healthy and strong. Every question about homework or friends or where she was going came from a place of wanting to protect her daughter, not control her. Mom's voice shook when she said she knew her anxiety probably felt suffocating, but it came from love, not manipulation. Heather sat very still listening, and her face changed from defensive to something softer. She admitted quietly that she never thought about what motivated Mom's behavior. She just felt the pressure and the constant monitoring and assumed it was about control. Rowan asked Heather to sit with that realization for a moment and really consider the difference between a parent acting from fear and love versus one acting from a desire to dominate. Heather nodded slowly and said she understood what Mom was saying, even if it didn't change how trapped she felt back then. Mom reached across the space between their chairs and touched Heather's hand briefly before pulling back. It wasn't forgiveness and it wasn't reconciliation, but it was a crack in the wall between them. Rowan said this was significant progress because Heather was starting to see beyond her own experience and consider other perspectives. We scheduled another session for the following week and left feeling like maybe healing was actually possible, even if it would take a long time. 8 weeks had passed since my wedding when I met Theo for coffee before work and told him the therapy sessions were actually helping. He looked relieved because he'd been worried about how much energy I was putting into fixing my family. We talked about maybe planning a short trip somewhere, just the two of us, to celebrate our marriage without all the drama. That afternoon, Rowan called to update me on her individual sessions with each family member. She said Heather was starting to acknowledge specific harm she caused, even though she wasn't ready for a full apology yet. Mom was working through her depression and learning to set better boundaries with both daughters. Dad was processing his anger in healthier ways and considering what role he wanted in the family going forward. The progress felt slow, but real. I asked Rowan if she thought we'd ever get back to something resembling normal, and she said families don't really go back, they just move forward into something different. That made sense, even though part of me wanted to believe we could somehow undo the damage and return to how things were before. 2 months after my wedding, I sat in a restaurant booth across from both my parents together for the first time in years. Mom had suggested lunch as a way to practice being around each other outside therapy, and Dad agreed, which shocked me. They sat next to each other but not too close, and there was obvious awkwardness in how they moved around each other's space. We ordered food and made small talk about work and weather and anything safe. Then Dad mentioned something about a family trip we took to the beach when I was 7, and Mom laughed. Actually laughed. She added details he'd forgotten about how Heather got stung by a jellyfish and refused to go back in the water for the rest of the week. They went back and forth sharing memories and laughing about things I barely remembered, and for those few minutes they looked like the parents I grew up with. But then the food came, and the moment passed and I could see the weight settle back on both of them. They weren't the same people who took that beach trip. 3 years of manufactured resentment and real divorce had changed them into different versions of themselves. I felt this bittersweet ache watching them because I could see glimpses of what they had, but I also knew their marriage was truly over. They could maybe become friends again, but they wouldn't be husband and wife. That chapter had closed even if the ending was written by someone else. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was at work, and Heather's name appeared on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. She was crying, which was so unusual that I immediately asked what was wrong. She said she'd just lost a major client and the whole situation was a mess. I asked what happened, and she explained that the client's wife had somehow heard about our family situation through mutual connections. The wife refused to work with someone who deliberately destroyed a marriage and convinced her husband to take their business elsewhere. Heather sounded genuinely upset and kept saying it wasn't fair that her personal life was affecting her career. I felt that familiar anger rise up because even now she was focused on how this impacted her, not on why it happened. I told her that actions have consequences beyond family relationships, and what she did to mom and dad was always going to follow her. She got quiet, and I could hear her breathing on the other end. She asked if I thought she deserved to lose her job over this, and I said I didn't know. But I did know that people judge us based on our choices. If she chose to manipulate and destroy, then people would see her as someone capable of manipulation and destruction. That reality didn't disappear just because it was inconvenient for her career. She hung up without saying goodbye, and I sat at my desk feeling both satisfied that she was facing real consequences and guilty for not being more sympathetic. That weekend, Caleb called and asked if he could stop by my apartment to talk. He showed up with coffee and pastries, and we sat on my couch while he told me about his latest conversation with Heather. He said he'd been meeting with her separately from the family sessions because she seemed more willing to be honest without everyone watching. Caleb thought Heather was starting to understand the size of what she'd done, even if her pride wouldn't let her fully admit it yet. He'd seen her crying after therapy sessions, which was significant because Heather rarely showed that kind of weakness. She'd told him she didn't realize how many people would be affected by her choices, and that the professional consequences were making her reconsider her justifications. Caleb said it wasn't a complete transformation, but it was movement in the right direction. I asked if he thought she'd ever really apologize, and he said he didn't know, but he was seeing cracks in her defensive walls. That had to count for something. 10 weeks after my wedding, Theo and I were planning a delayed celebration dinner with our friends who'd been at the reception. We wanted to actually enjoy ourselves without family drama hanging over everything. I was making the guest list when my phone buzzed with a text from Dad asking if he could come to the dinner. I stared at the message for a long time because it was the first time in 3 years that Dad had asked to be included in something in my life. He'd missed my engagement and my wedding planning and so many regular moments, and now he was asking to be part of this small celebration. I called him instead of texting back, and when he answered, I was already crying. I told him yes, of course he could come, and I was so happy he wanted to be there. His voice got thick with emotion, and he said he'd missed too much already, and didn't want to miss anymore. We talked for almost an hour about nothing important, and everything important, and when we hung up, I felt like maybe we were actually rebuilding something real. A few days later, Mom called with news that surprised me. She was dating someone, a man she'd met through a grief support group she'd been attending for people going through divorce. She sounded almost shy telling me about him, like she wasn't sure if it was okay to be moving on. I asked how she felt, and she said it was strange but also healthy to look forward instead of staying stuck in what happened. She seemed lighter when she talked about this new person, and about her life in general. I realized the divorce might have been better for her in the long run, even though the method was terrible and traumatic. She'd been so focused on being a wife and mother for so long that maybe she needed this forced separation to figure out who she was on her own. It didn't make what Heather did okay, but it did add complicated layers to the outcome. 11 weeks after my wedding, Rowan called to tell me Heather had written a letter to our parents. She'd helped Heather work on it during their individual sessions, and thought it represented real progress. Rowan read parts of it to me over the phone. Heather acknowledged specific things she'd done, like planting the earring and deleting the text messages, and booking the fake business trip. She admitted that her response to feeling controlled was way out of proportion to the actual situation. She wrote that she understood now how much pain she caused, and that understanding didn't erase the harm, but it was a starting point. The letter wasn't a complete apology because Heather still defended some of her feelings, even while admitting her actions were wrong. But it was more than she'd given before. Rowan said this was significant for someone who rarely admitted fault about anything. She was sending the letter to Mom and Dad that afternoon, and wanted me to know in case they called upset or emotional. I thanked her and sat with the knowledge that maybe Heather was actually capable of growth, even if it was happening slowly and painfully. 3 months after my wedding, our family gathered at my apartment for dinner. I'd spent all day cooking and cleaning and trying to make everything perfect because I wanted this to work. Mom arrived first with wine and flowers, looking nervous but determined. Dad came next, and he and Mom exchanged awkward hellos before settling into different parts of my living room. Heather showed up last, and the temperature in the room dropped when she walked in. Dad barely looked at her, and she kept her distance from him. We sat down to eat, and the conversation was stilted and careful, like we were all walking on broken glass. Heather and Dad didn't speak directly to each other the whole night, but everyone stayed. Everyone tried. We were all in the same room attempting to move forward, and that would have been impossible just weeks ago. The tension was obvious and uncomfortable, but we got through the meal without anyone leaving or fighting. When everyone left, I cleaned up the dishes and cried because it was both progress and proof of how broken we still were. During dinner, Dad had pulled me into the kitchen while I was getting dessert. He put his hand on my shoulder and told me thank you for not giving up on this family. He said watching me fight to keep everyone connected inspired him to try harder, even when it felt pointless. I told him I learned that kind of stubbornness from Mom, And he smiled this sad smile and agreed. He said Mom always was the strongest person he knew, even if it took him too long to remember that. We stood there for a moment in my small kitchen, and I felt grateful that at least Dad and I had found our way back to each other, even if the whole family was still figuring things out. Our last therapy session with Rowan happened on a Thursday afternoon in early February, when the sun came through her office windows and made everything look softer than it really was. Mom sat on the left side of the couch, and Dad sat on the right with me in the middle like I'd been doing for 3 months now. Heather came late and took the chair by the door like she always did when she couldn't avoid showing up. Rowan looked at her notes and then at each of us before she started talking about progress. She said we'd done really hard work facing the manipulation and starting to rebuild trust between people who'd been hurt badly. She talked about how Mom and Dad were communicating again and how I'd kept everyone connected even when it would have been easier to walk away. Then she looked at Heather and said she was glad Heather had started acknowledging the harm she caused, even though it was difficult. But Rowan's face got more serious when she told us that healing from this kind of betrayal takes years, not months. She said we'd made remarkable progress in 12 weeks, but we were just getting started on the real work. She recommended that Mom and Dad keep seeing their individual therapists, and that Heather stay in therapy to work on why she chose manipulation instead of honest communication. Rowan suggested we do family check-ins every few months instead of weekly sessions, so we could practice what we'd learned without depending on her to keep us talking. Everyone agreed to keep working on rebuilding trust because none of us wanted to waste the progress we'd made. 3 weeks later, Theo and I finally got on a plane to Hawaii for the honeymoon we should have taken right after our wedding. The hotel upgraded us to a better room when they heard we'd postponed because of a family emergency, and Theo joked that maybe we should have more emergencies if it meant ocean views this good. I stood on our balcony looking at the beach and realized I wasn't thinking about Mom crying, or Dad's anger, or Heather's manipulation for the first time in months. Theo came up behind me and put his arms around my waist and asked what I was thinking about. I told him I was thinking about nothing, and he laughed because he knew that was actually something worth celebrating. We spent 5 days swimming and eating too much food, and sleeping late and not checking my phone every 10 minutes to see if someone in my family needed something. On our 3rd day, I was lying on the beach reading a book when Theo asked if I thought we'd ever have a normal family dinner where nobody was processing trauma. I said maybe in a few years, and he said that was good enough for him. Being away from all the family drama helped me see how much work everyone had done. Mom was going to therapy and setting boundaries. Dad was talking to me regularly and trying with Heather even though it was hard. Heather was at least admitting she'd caused harm even if she wasn't fully apologizing yet. I could actually relax without constantly worrying about the next crisis or who needed me to fix something. When we got back home, I met Mom for coffee at the place near her house that she'd been going to since I was a kid. She looked different somehow, and it took me a minute to realize she looked happy. Not fake happy or trying happy, but genuinely peaceful in a way I hadn't seen since before the divorce. She told me about a painting class she'd started taking, and a book club she'd joined, and how she was thinking about going back to the school to finish her degree. I asked if she was okay, and she said she was genuinely happy for the first time since before everything fell apart. She said working through the manipulation with Rowan helped her understand herself better. She realized she'd spent 28 years being a wife and mother without figuring out who she was as just herself. Mom said she wished it hadn't happened the way it did, but the divorce forced her to build a life that was hers, instead of just being part of someone else's life. She'd set better boundaries with both me and Heather about how much she got involved in our choices. She said she'd found peace with how things turned out even though the method was terrible and traumatic. Watching her talk about her painting class and her new friends made me realize that sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to growth we wouldn't have chosen but needed anyway. 6 months after my wedding, I was making dinner in my apartment when I realized our family was in a much better place even though we weren't fully healed. Mom and Dad had coffee together every few weeks and could laugh about old memories without the manufactured resentment Heather had built between them. I talked to Dad regularly, and he'd started coming to dinners at my place and asking about my life in ways he hadn't done in years. Heather was still in therapy working on her control issues and why she chose manipulation over honest conversation when she felt suffocated. My marriage to Theo was stronger because we'd weathered a massive family crisis together in our first few months and figured out how to support each other through really hard things. Life wasn't perfect, and some wounds would always be there. Dad and Heather barely spoke, and probably wouldn't have a close relationship for years if ever. Mom still had moments where she got sad about the divorce and the time she lost. I still got angry sometimes when I thought about how Heather destroyed our family because she didn't like being asked about homework. But we were all moving forward instead of staying stuck in the pain and anger. We were building something new from the broken pieces, and that was enough for now.